man fails. Let's talk about Russia. Let's keep the thing up. All right. So Zelensky is melting down. And he is showing peak desperation in the context of his melting down. Now, it is one thing to be in a war. It is one thing to lose that war. It is one thing to be in a pressure cooker. And I would argue that Zelensky is in a pressure cooker. You have reports coming out of the West, article after article after article, that Zelensky, oh my God, he's being authoritarian. We know how to fight back. Zelensky is betraying Ukraine. They put in Sapo Nabu in Parliament. It goes through very fast. And then with all of the attacks that are taking place in the media, immediately start rolling it back. Now, let's be very clear. I know I had the conversation with Jeff Rich, where Jeff Rich was saying a lot of this stuff was natural in regards to the protests. Maybe not. I'm very skeptical about the naturalness of the protests that were coming out. All of these people coming out almost immediately as soon as he passes it for these two organizations that I have no idea how many Ukrainians even know about, and was set up by the United States in order to effectively oversee Zelensky, calling them corruption organizations, despite the fact that Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the history of countries. And yet, what the hell was this organization doing as their corruptness didn't go anywhere? But all of a sudden, the moment he makes a move for it, they freak out. Here's the catch, though. Zelensky was not wrong in going after these organizations. These organizations were American organizations. So when they were making this argument that we're going to be a colony, that's where that was coming from. This was his way of trying to ensure his power base, especially with all of the reports that were coming out that they were going to try to replace him with Zelensky. And then you get Zelensky doing photo shoots in Vogue. Okay, that's weird. They're trying to soften his image, like, ooh, he plays with puppies. Well, okay, yeah, okay. That's a little weird. Now, if you remember, Zelensky had his own photo shoot where he was hugging his wife very passionately. I had in my mind, you screaming at the camera, more passion. You want to win this war? God damn it, give me some passion. Didn't help him win the war, but he had a very attractive wife in the photo shoot. So if you're Zelensky, what are you thinking? Chasiv Yar just fell. You have protesters at your gates. You know those protesters were inspired on some level by the West. Your military situation is getting better. You have hundreds of thousands of people deserting, millions of people who are dead. And you're losing, and you know you're losing. What do? Especially when you get Europe saying we're not going to give you any money if you're going after these organizations. You go back and backtrack in order to force the Rada to pass legislation to give back the quote unquote independence, kind of those organizations. That's a kind of, because there's a provision in about lie detector tests, which you can imagine those could be faked if indeed you want to get rid of a particular person. But ideally, you've given back some level of independence of these organizations, and yet you still have protests. And the protests haven't gone anywhere. The Russian military is on the move. You can't stop them. It's even been reported in the West, CNN of no less places, reporting how these slow movements, this lava flow, inexorably moving to the West, that you lack the capacity, the power, the manpower, competence to do anything about. What do? What Zelensky does is he comes out and give a coked up speech begging for Western powers to overthrow the Russian government. Get rid of Putin is what he's effectively saying. What he's saying here is outrageous nonsense. But just to read it, Zelensky calls on the world community to change the regime in Russia. Otherwise, quote, Russia will attack the rest of the world, unquote. If the world community does not demand regime change in Russia, it means that even after the war is over, Moscow would continue to try to destabilize neighboring states. It would continue to spend huge amounts of money, resources, perhaps even lives on this. One of Putin's key ideas, which now has become mainstream in Russian society, is Russia has no borders where it does not want to recognize them. This is nonsense.
So, one of Putin's main ideas.
This is complete nonsense. I had the conversation earlier today with Arno where my argument to him or question to him was, why doesn't Russia get involved? Meaning you have all of these states, Azerbaijan, Armenia, etc., these former Soviet states, you can even put Ukraine in that list, that are, let's say, in the Russian sphere of influence. Now, I told you on more than one occasion, I'm an American. I think like an American in the way that I look at the world. My values, for better or for worse, come from this country. And so the values of this country is influence in the various states that are around you. Now, no, I don't mean paying kill squads in the way that the US did. And no, I don't necessarily mean overthrowing governments. I do mean, in the sense of NGOs, or for that matter, media. Now, you could say RT and Sputnik, fair enough. But the way that the West uses influence, it's not overt, it's subversive. You have NGOs, you have organizations, you have embassies that see the public with a certain point of view that is not entirely transparent in the way that the point of view is being raised. This is statecraft. Whether I like it or not is besides the point. I'm saying it's the way the West operates in the way that in the various countries. So when you get Armenia that is leaning heavily to the West, when you get Azerbaijan that was responsible on some level of attacking Russia, this doesn't look like Russia is playing this influence game. And Arno even made the point of saying, yeah, culturally, we don't like to do that. What he's saying here is nonsense. It's desperation. Oh my God, Russia's going to attack the world. I would tell you, Russia went into Ukraine with 150,000 troops. And when Putin was giving his interview, it was clear that he wasn't certain of how this was going to turn out. It was just forced in this case. You had a Ukrainian government that was overthrown by the United States working with Europe and a bunch of neo-Nazis. The legitimacy and the sovereignty of that government went up in smoke in 2014. You had CIA in that government for decades, seeding it with a point of view, pushing it in a particular direction. This was a war that, according to William Burns, Russia didn't necessarily want to get involved in, but it was a civil war on their border that the West, for all intents and purposes, provoked. If this was on our border in Mexico, we would have destroyed Mexico a lot earlier and a lot sooner. And we would kick gloves on this notion of we wanted to keep civilian casualties down. Again, I'm an American. It's the way we think. So the fact that Russia goes in is not shocking to us because we would have did the exact same thing. The fact that they're being very careful in the amount of civilian casualties, okay, we don't think that way. We wouldn't have done that. I'm glad they're doing it. I'm just saying Russia's not doing anything different than what the United States would have done in the context of ensuring the integrity of the country. And the idea of putting NATO on the Russian border is outlandish. They understood it was outlandish. Moving 1 inch to the east was something that they weren't necessarily supposed to do. They didn't just go to the east, they went to the border with this notion of trying to surround the country, creating a Hobbes choice of either you get involved militarily or you allow yourself to be militarily surrounded, or at the very least, having NATO on your border. This was obnoxious to even do. This war should have never happened. And a little bit of, it was purely statecraft in the way that they had provoked this conflict. My point is that the Russian government didn't have this notion of, we want to take over all of NATO with 150,000 troops. No way. This was purely about preventing the expansion of NATO to the border of Ukraine after the government of Ukraine was overthrown. It was that. Whether it's in fact or whether it's de facto, because you're effectively putting in weapons, troops, and everything else, is irrelevant to the point. Same difference. So Zelensky making this argument that Russia wants to attack all of NATO. Russia has done any and everything in their power to prevent expansion of the war. They didn't attack Germany when Germany is like, hey, we're going to give them Taurus missiles. They didn't hit various countries in Europe, even though you could make an argument that there's a casus belli if they're putting in weapons and materials and all of this other stuff into the countries. They kept it isolated to Ukraine because Ukraine was the issue. Zelensky is talking nonsense. He's talking nonsense. There is no want, there's no energy, none of that stuff to attack Europe. What it comes across as, though, with the Russophobia that is being steeped into Europe, that there seems to be this want of using Ukraine as a battering ram to take down Russia. And now that it's become clear that this idea of doing that, it has not worked, will not work, and Ukraine is failing miserably at that task, that they're using Ukraine, feeding them to the Russians almost as a way of gaining time for them to come up with some military thing in Europe that would allow them to be fed to the Russians themselves, meaning feeding Europeans to the Russians. Will they be able to do this? Who knows? Will the political coalitions that they have in these major governments withstand them doing that? Even with all of the propaganda and everything else that they put into their people, will the people say, yes, we're willing to be fed to the wood chipper of the Russian military? I don't know. But that's not Russia attacking NATO. That is the other way around. I hope you get my point. When they're talking about putting European troops in Ukraine, that's a tripwire. Those people will be killed. You have to kill those people, because if you don't, it allows them to put more troops into the theater of conflict. What happens when Kiev gets taken? Who knows? Europe is going to flip out. The US is going to flip out. Part of the reason that Donald Trump is like, I'm doing 10 days as opposed to 50 is because you can see what is happening on the battlefield, and the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. Every syllable that comes out of my mouth is a Ukrainian that has just been killed. And this has been taking place day in after day out. What you're seeing from Zelensky is just desperation. That's all. Desperate man that doesn't know what to do, that is being assailed on all sides. Desperate man knows that his military is collapsing. Desperate man knows that hundreds of thousands of people have deserted. Desperate man knows that all of those people are out there protesting him right now. Desperate man knows that those people were most likely pushed, inspired, paid by the West with the idea of getting rid of him. This is just desperation. He knows it's failing. He gets it. And so the only thing he can do is beg for quote unquote regime change. If they could have got rid of Putin, they would have got rid of Putin. And one last point to make on this. The reason that Donald Trump wants to freeze the conflict has everything to do with the idea that Putin is in office in the first place. What I mean by that is, if you can make this something similar to Syria, where you can say, I'm going to freeze what is taking place, and maybe later on down the line, we will get somebody in that is not as competent as Putin, or we can somehow take this over, or we can somehow, somebody who's not as competent, who maybe leans further to the West, who maybe we're willing to negotiate with, where we can get a better deal. If we can freeze this 5 years, 10 years, maybe we can accomplish our objectives. It's not like this notion of primacy takes place all in 1 year. This is a long-term project of maintaining geopolitical control and expanding your geopolitical control. It took how long for Syria to collapse? 20 years? For them finally to get Assad to be like, hey, maybe I can negotiate with these monsters. And for him to actually believe it before his government was overthrown. I'm saying the same thing is true in the way that they're effectively dealing with Russia, where they're realizing we lost. So we need to freeze it. And we'll come back to it later where we think we'll have a better chance and a better opportunity to win. At this point, Russia knows that, which is why they're not freezing anything at all. They're going to win and accomplish their objectives on the battlefield. If you have a deal that you can make with them that is legitimate, okay, we're open to it. Otherwise, we will keep going. Zelensky's days are numbered. Whether he is hung on a flagpole or a light pole in Kiev, whether he takes a bunch of money and head to Paris, whether he is deposed by somebody that is around him, whether the West decides to get rid of whatever that is, whether it's Russia taking Kiev, whatever that is, his days are numbered. He knows he has no other faculty to assist him in whatever the hell he's doing. So the best thing that he can do is make a video in a bunker begging for other countries to do what they have no power to do. Please overthrow the Russian government. That is desperation incarnate. And no, your prayers will not be answered. There's that. There is. All right, let's go into another news story. I showed you Zelensky freaking out. What about Putin, right? Like, if Zelensky is in peak desperation, what is Putin doing? So Putin is chilling with the breeze, a dog, Lukashenko, and he's given this kind of interview while he's out there with him. What's important is what he says. So they're asking him questions. There are a few of these videos, by the way, so I'm going to go through a few of these.
Можно ждать, если руководство Украины считает, что сейчас не время, а нужно подождать, пожалуйста, мы готовы подождать.
So he's talking about Ukraine. Well, if their leadership thinks that they need to wait for new leadership, okay, we can do that. We can wait. It's okay. It's okay. We can wait. Compare that to Zelensky. Oh my God, we need regime change in Russia. Because again, he knows that there's nothing else he could do. One man is saying, yeah, we can wait. If we need to do that, we can do it. Because what he knows is that the military situation in Petrovsk, Chasiv Yar, Kramatorsk, name, pick a pony, Zaporozhye, that there's pressure on all of these points at the exact same time. He knows it. He knows that the speed of the summer offensive is only going to increase, especially now that Chasiv Yar has fallen and Petrovsk is about to collapse. So for him, military situation is going fine. Like Captain America, we can do this all year. We have no issue waiting. If they want to wait, we can do that. But understand, you're waiting in the context of a worsening military situation. Just know it. We can wait. They have another interview where Putin is talking about, here's another one right here. They're asking him about this. He comes out and says this. Come on.
Конечно. Поэтому
Все по плану.
не переживайте за безопасность.
Everything is going according to plan. Everything is fine. We can wait. Here's another one. He's talking about effectively Trump. In fact, let me go to this one first. I think it's this one right here. Right here. He's talking about Trump in the White House because Donald Trump has been a weirdo. He's just been a weirdo. Under normal circumstances, when you're talking about negotiations, you're talking about behind the scenes negotiations. And then you come out and say, okay, this is what we agreed upon. Well, Donald Trump, as an American president, can't accept the fact that he lost. It's his war. He can't accept that. His ego, his sense of entitlement, his sense of hubris, his sense of Western elitism doesn't account for it. His reality can't absorb. You failed, and you failed miserably. Now, if you keep screaming, this is Joe Biden's war, then it should have been easy for you to walk from Joe Biden's war. But he can't do that. He could. He doesn't do it. And so instead, what you get is him freaking out, panicked, screaming at the Russians, oh my God, I can't believe the Russians are doing this. It's a disgrace what they're doing, as he allows the genocide that he pays for to take place. But the Russians are the issue. So Putin's point is, look, this is not the way dialogue is done. And you can scream, you can yell, you can act like a toddler, you can be immature, you can do all of it you want. Have fun. Be as belligerent and as ridiculous as you want. We are pursuing our military aims. That's it. Period. This is him making that point. Again, very chilled, very laid back, in the breeze, playing with the dog, talking to Lukashenko like we're buddies.
Это известное общее правило. Но для того, чтобы подойти к решению вопроса мирным путем, нужно вести обстоятельные разговоры. И не на публике, а это делать нужно спокойно, в тиши переговорного процесса. И именно для этого мы предложили создать 3 группы, о которых вы упомянули. Что касается каких-то разочарований со стороны кого бы то ни было, то все разочарования, они возникают от избыточных ожиданий.
All disappointments rise from excessive expectations. You came into this claiming that you were going to end the war in 24 hours. That's stupid. You claim and you believe that as an American president, you can have a conversation and dictate terms. That's stupid. These are your excessive expectations that are not grounded in reality. Now that you have to deal with actual reality, you are freaking out and you're not handling it all that well. Your excessive expectations is the problem, not the negotiation process. The notion that I'm going to have a conversation with you and you believe I'm going to do something that is going to be adverse to the interests of Russia as it wins a war is your issue, not mine. Period. Your excessive expectations is the problem. That's the issue. If you want to have a conversation calmly in the privacy of a negotiation room, we can do that. But if your belief is that you're going to get us to call for an unconditional ceasefire while you give more weapons, intelligence, etc., you're out of your goddamn mind. You're running a shadow war under the actual war and pretending as if you're not a party to this conflict. You're not a negotiator. You are literally the main mover and shaker of this conflict and the main provocateur that caused this conflict. So if you want to talk, we can talk. If you want to be belligerent, you can do that on Twitter, on social media, whatever you want to do. That doesn't change what we're doing on the ground, nor does it change our military objectives. Full stop. It's reasonable, rational, and his point is, obviously, makes sense. Trump is a child, and he acts like a child. Even though he's a 70-something-year-old man, it's astonishing that you get that high in life or that age, and you still act like a toddler. You can do that, but this is the real world. If you want to have negotiations, then you need to come to those negotiations with the understanding that you've lost a conflict that you provoked, and then maybe we can talk. But if you have these unreasonable expectations in regards to your own brilliance, sanity, competence, etc., and you think that a declining empire that has just lost the war, has no cards in that war, that you are going to somehow give up something, then yes, you're going to feel some kind of way because you're not going to get your way. America is just going to have to accept that it is not the 1990s. And in the context of your perception of Russia, your perception is wrong. The fact that you lost this war and losing this war should have gotten that across. Now, Putin is saying that very calmly because from his point of view, he's winning. There's no pressure in this way, in the way that Zelensky is being espoused or coming out of Zelensky where he's screaming for regime change. He's not screaming for anything. Calm, deliberate, confident. That is not being seen on the side of Zelensky in his video where he is screaming for somebody to overthrow the Russian government. Another one of these that is very interesting is talking about Europe. And he's pointing out, look, Europe didn't have much sovereignty to begin with. Putin also points out peace requires real dialogue, not spectacle for the cameras. You being a child on camera has nothing to do with us and dialogue for real trying to end the war. And truth be told, maybe what it takes is for it to become brimmingly clear beyond the clarity of now, like supernova clear, that Ukraine is collapsing, and they are collapsing. But maybe it needs to be they're pressuring Kiev. Maybe it needs to be they are about to collapse militarily, meaning maybe what it requires is for it to become so starkly clear that Ukraine is fundamentally lost that the American president is willing to accept the Russian terms, effectively surrender. Because from Putin's point of view, that's effectively what it is. When you're saying the 5 regions are ours, but if you keep it up, there will be more. Okay, that's telling you something very clearly, that we will keep going until it's necessary. When they say no NATO expansion, when they point out that the Ukrainian government is going to have to accept those regions, okay, can you really foresee this type of government accepting those regions? Which almost insinuates that you need a new government in play, or at the very least, that this government is going to be overthrown by losing the war. So what can you do as an American president to prevent that? I suppose you can put in American troops. And at that point, you're talking about potentially a nuclear war. Short of that, you have no cards, as Trump would say. This is Putin having this conversation about Europe, effectively saying, look, Europe didn't have that much sovereignty or independence to begin with. So,
Этим сразу
right here.
в современном мире, это всегда было важно, а сегодня особенно, суверенитет играет, можно сказать, ключевую роль, в том числе и для экономического развития. Вот было ясно, что суверенитета у Евросоюза, у Европы не так уж и много. Сегодня стало очевидно, что его нету вообще. А за этим сразу следует, вот в той ситуации критической, которая сложилась, следуют и экономические потери, и утрата суверенитета политического сейчас ведет к утрате и экономического суверенитета, и к колоссальным потерям. Поэтому я всегда об этом говорил. Одна из ключевых задач, в том числе и задач ВСО, укрепление суверенитета России. В современном
God, man, he's so much more competent when he talks. He's making a basic point. Europe and its sovereignty is effectively toast. And if you don't have the ability to have economic sovereignty, then political sovereignty goes along with it. When Trump goes to Europe and says, I'm going to pass X number of sanctions, and Europe says, Daddy, please don't do that. Well, what does it mean? You're talking about an economic union that Donald Trump is effectively can pull their chain, especially now that they've tried to tie themselves closer to the US. Now, I know some people will make the argument that this is purely theatrical. Yes and no. The amount of money that they can invest in the United States, yes, that's a no. That's not going to happen. Even the amount of oil. Okay, again, the LNG, that's not going to happen. But when you're talking about 15% tariffs, you're talking about companies that are going to take an L from those tariffs. There's a reason why these countries are responding to the tariff thing, because it's going to damage their economy on some level. And so when you get mayors, I believe, saying, hey, we're going to take a hit for this, and there are going to be some companies that don't survive, or von der Leyen saying, yes, there's going to be companies that don't survive because they can't tolerate it. They're not making that up. You can say that it's theatrical on some level, yes, but this is Europe making a choice to chain itself to America in a way that is going to be detrimental for Europe, especially if the US decides to pull their chain, considering that economic sovereignty has been closer to now the US. I mean, fact of the matter is, the moment that a country is saying, 4% of the population, by the way, of the world, says, we're going to damage your economy if you don't do X or Y, just like we're doing in Canada right now, or for that matter, tariffing the world. The response to that, if you're a sovereign nation, should be to F off, not Daddy, don't leave. Daddy, don't leave is humiliating. Europe is Daddy, don't leave. You would think that a country would try to say, okay, we need to do something different. We can't chain ourselves to another country like this. We can't be damaged economically like this. That's not what they do. Donald Trump is effectively going after Canada because Canada decided to make a political position on the issue of Gaza. Think about that. Think about the balls that you have to say, I'm going to damage you economically because you are making a political decision. Okay, what is this about Europe? If Europe makes a political decision, does Donald Trump also decide, hey, I know we agreed on 50%, but now I'm going up to 30% because I don't like what you did? And does it affect your political disposition and political point of view in regards to the choices that you make as a, quote, sovereign nation? Well, the answer is obviously yes. What is Canada going to do now? Is Canada going to backtrack on what they're doing? Who knows? But there's obviously political pressure being applied to him. When he's doing this to Brazil, saying, I'm going to put 50% sanctions on Brazil or tariffs on Brazil, what is Brazil going to do? Brazil is going to say F off. Now, a lot of the stuff is responsible or is in response to the BRICS. Trump has said it himself, that many of the stuff like the secondary sanctions that's going to Russia and everything else are in response to the BRICS. They put thousands of sanctions on Russia. And Trump, in the recent interview that he gave, pointed out Putin probably doesn't care. Why? Because Putin, and over the time frame that Russia has been in action and they've been putting the sanctions on, have become far more self-sufficient than European states. Europe is not a sovereign entity in the way that it operates. And it has been making choices that has been to the detriment of Europe. Money has been fleeing out of Europe. Think about the war, for example, the blowing up of Nord Stream pipeline. Think about the sanctions what Europe has passed. All of this stuff because of a war. And the gas and the energy that Europe was getting is the thing that was allowing Europe to be Europe. It's not like Europe was a thing unto itself, that it could do anything that it wanted. It was able to get cheap Russian energy. Russia wasn't engaging in its politics. It wasn't intruding into what it wanted in its political affairs. The US is. And so this garden that they called themselves was only allowed to be a garden because they had energy at a particular price point where they could sell products at a certain amount, heat their homes at a certain amount, allow their companies and industries to function at a certain amount. That is gone. So now they will buy Russian fuel, but they would get it from Saudi Arabia or India, or they would try to get LNG from the US that's 5 times more than what they were paying before. And add in now the sanctions, add in the weapons that they were buying, that again, they were getting from the predominantly the US. That is money that is flowing out of Europe into the United States. Europeans don't seem to recognize it, but that's what's been happening. The businesses that have been going belly up, especially in Germany. Look at what's been taking place economically in Germany. It is devastating. And yet, this is the path that they've chosen to go. So when Putin is making this point of saying, look, these guys don't seem to be a sovereign state or states. And on top of that being a sovereign states, politically, or the economic associations, has political consequences about what they decide and want to do for their own countries, or for the matter, what's in the best interest. And up to this point, they have not been taking actions and decisions that are in the best interest. Look, you could say, well, the Ukraine war has created perturbation in that. Yeah, but who provoked that war? Who overthrew that government in 2014? Who made the choice that Ukraine and Georgia are going to be part of NATO in 2008 in the Bucharest summit? Okay, well, they didn't have to do that. You didn't have to expand NATO to the border. You didn't have to overthrow the government of Ukraine. You didn't have to blow off the Minsk agreements. You didn't have to blow off the Istanbul agreements. You didn't have to do any of that stuff. All of those things were provocative. And yet, that was the choice of the US, using NATO as a power projection device, with Europe going along with it, and with Europe continuing to go along with it. This idea that Russia just wanted to invade Ukraine and take over all of NATO is propaganda that they use to try to justify the military expenditures that they're effectively putting out. It has no basis in reality. He's not wrong. Just point out he's not wrong. Let's play some chess. Let's play some chess. Again, after each loss, I will go through a news item, a news bit. I'm probably going to put those two together in a video on its own, cutting out the chess part, but still, let's play some chess. And this might be the last round because it is, yeah, it's getting late. It's 12:45 in the morning here.